Hi there, and welcome to Be a Global Citizen, the podcast that explores the concept of global citizenship through the lens of value-creating education. My name is Scott Bauer, and I'm a SOCA researcher and educator. I hope you find the discussions, stories, and insights on this podcast to be valuable and inspiring as we strive to become global citizens who are committed to living a contributive life. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Christine Hwang. I'm based in Somerville, Massachusetts right now, and I work as an online learning fellow at the Teaching and Learning Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
Hi, Christine. Thank you so much for being on the podcast with me today. I'm very excited to learn more about your journey as an educator, what brought you to a place like Harvard. And I know from our previous conversations that you've lived different parts of the world and you've had really interesting experience growing up at an international school in China, and then found your way back to the U.S. and it seems that you have this like bicultural experience of kind of having a foot in different cultures and kind of how to navigate that, not just linguistically, but socially and culturally, and how to contribute towards young people and their learning experiences in the current digital age that we find ourselves in. So what does the future of education look like? And what are you kind of envisioning in the work that you're doing in the online spaces and beyond? And I'll also say that I had the great pleasure of meeting you in person not too long ago. We were in Washington, D.C. At the embassy of the People's Republic of China. And it was just so cool to be able to speak to recent experiences visiting China with a group and to engage in just exchange programs and discussions about education and like innovation. So all of that has really led me to feel like, wow, I want to learn more about your story. So this is an opportunity for you to step into that space, and wanted to pass it over to you, Christine, to just share some of the milestones of your journey.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm thinking back, there's so much that has shaped who I am right now, but I kind of have to start from the very beginning. It's funny because people always ask me like, "Oh, where are you from? Like, where's home?" And then I'm like, "Do you want the whole life story, or do you want a quick, dirty rundown?" And I usually just say like, "I was born in Hong Kong, but I moved to the U.S. Because of parents' work reasons when I was pretty young, like 3 years old. Lived in New Jersey for a couple years before my family moved to Shanghai, to China, where I lived at this point like half of my life, all of grade school. So I went to an international school there, and was exposed to American culture for the most part, but also in a school that was very grounded in traditional Chinese academics and some of the culture, even the stress associated with that. But I think through this process, and then through getting like a really good education, like my teachers in high school were amazing, it made me reflect a lot more on what does it mean to be a good educator, to be a good student, and to because our school was an IB school, so like the idea of global citizenship was very much founded in that as well. And so how to work and understand different perspectives and people from different backgrounds. So I think that like idea of navigating different cultures was always ingrained in me. And then as I went to undergrad, I approached education through the field of psychology first because I was really interested in mental health, and youth mental health in particular. And then when I was volunteering as a tutor for this elementary school program during undergrad, I really fell in love with the educator community and felt like that this was the space that I wanted to be in. And so post-undergrad, I joined Teach for America, and I was teaching for a couple years in Baltimore City Public Schools, where I taught multilingual learners, mostly newcomer students in high school and middle school, on a variety of subjects, but mostly like social studies and biology as well. And I think that was a really interesting kind of combination of some of my personal backgrounds with my professional interests in education, because I really resonated with my students backgrounds. Most of them were not Chinese speaking, but just coming from, different parts of the world, mostly Latin America, and then some from Afghanistan, from Nepal as well. Was a really rewarding experience to feel like I can be a part of their journey of adjusting to the US, just as I had to adjust in my own way, navigating different worlds as I came to this country. So that piece was very important for me throughout. And then on top of that, I was really interested in how technology could play a role in supporting students as a consumer of technology, curator of technology in my classroom spaces, and seeing how my colleagues struggled with using certain tools or students struggling with using those tools. So all those reflections led me to apply to graduate programs oriented towards learning design and technology. And so I ended up at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. It's a one-year program, very densely packed. So I graduated last year and then got the opportunity to stay on as a staff member. It brought me to working at the Teaching and Learning Lab, where I've kind of just explore my range of potential within education sectors, moved a bit from K-12 to higher education. So instead of supporting K-12 students directly, which is still near and dear to my heart, supporting faculty who are often working with teachers who are working with students, and translating their ideas into an online context and making sure things are just running smoothly for mostly OEL students, the online master's program students. And that's been also an interesting journey in itself, just kind of understanding more of the back end of higher ed. And in between, there were a lot of experiences that have kept me, even within the EdTech space, still very oriented towards being learner-centered and understanding learners who come from different cultures, especially. One of those was a study abroad program I did when I was an undergrad in Uganda, where I was doing school-based research on school-related gender-based violence, which is a whole other topic in itself. But also some of my work in the past had focused on global education issues and translating it into a Chinese context as well, working for a communications consulting firm. And so it's a hodgepodge of experiences that I think now I want to be at the intersection of being a liaison between EdTech providers and students, and in particularly focusing on students who might be coming from really diverse backgrounds culturally or other linguistic identities wise. Yeah, so it's hopefully a somewhat coherent summary of everything that's going on in my head right now.
Oh, it is, and it's always the impossible task of being able to condense so many life experiences into just, a few minutes or so. But this is a lot, right, to work with already. So thank you so much, Christine, for sharing that background of yours. And it's very clear that this theme of navigating new spaces, whether that be geographically and culture based, right, in terms of going to different countries, or even on the digital frontier of where are these technologies heading, and how can we be able to better equip teachers with these technologies, and create learning environments that really have this deeper connection, right? Facilitating that experience for the students is something that you're really interested in exploring. And a lot of what it takes to navigate new spaces, I think, is courage, right? Because there's so much unknown as far as not just the space I'm entering into, but the person that you are entering into it. You bring your own sense of identity, but identities are never fixed entities in my belief. I think that there's so much negotiating that comes into being exposed to new ways of seeing the world, and new approaches to conducting a class. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that you have to quickly adapt and learn, and so you become a master of how you even learn yourself. And
Absolutely.
I'm curious, with being born in Hong Kong, you said then you went to the US, and all in kind of your early years. But I would say probably the shift from New Jersey to Shanghai was probably something that you initially really had to process by making new friends, and then kind of adapting to this international environment. Um, what was that learning process for you in terms of kind of really making sense of your new life in Shanghai? And yeah, maybe we could start there.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like when you're a child, you're kind of like a sponge, which is great. So in some ways, like the process was not as difficult coming from the US to China, but what did stand out to me was adjusting. So when I first went to Shanghai, I started out in a more local school system, and the environment there was a lot more about like, okay, make sure you're following all the rules, like rules like you shouldn't be going to bathroom during class because you should be focused, or even little things like your hands should be on your lap the whole time, just to make sure you're like, sitting in your seat properly. I think those were things that I had to adjust to, like academic culture wise. I think I remember at least like there were like a couple of students whom I like immediately became friends with because I was like, "Oh, you speak English too," or like you're also from the U.S. in some ways. Um, so that was part of it. Definitely the adjustment. Um, I think beyond that, it was I just can't, because again, I think when you're a kid, I was 7 years old when I came to Shanghai. Um, it's a lot easier to adapt in that area. What I thought was more interesting was I got the opportunity to go back to the US for a couple times during the summer for this like summer program. So I'm fortunate that my parents had the means to send me to like live with relatives in the US when I grew up in Shanghai as well. And so I went to this like nerd camp in the US, and I think it was kind of like reverse culture shock in some ways. Or like at that point, I don't even know how to identify, because I feel like there are parts of my identity that were like, oh, I listen to like American pop culture music or like mainstream media, and but at the same time, like there are certain like social interaction patterns that um or like the culture and social culture in general, like in China, can be a bit more reserved. And so like going to a summer camp with other middle schoolers in the US, again, was kind of an interesting adjustment, just to see like different personalities that came out of people. Um, I think overall though, that adjustment was positive and eye opening for me, to as a way to like stay in touch with uh my experiences in the US as well, knowing that this is a country I was going to go back to study in college, most likely, and now live in. Uh, but yeah, I think that there were, I guess if I were to try to frame it into like a spectrum, there are many pieces within it. It's just like going to a place in China that's a bit more reserved in many ways, where like rule following became the norm, versus going to summer camp in the US where breaking rules in some ways was encouraged. Like not obviously not legal things, but just like, exploring your identity and using summer as a time to like have fun. And so I think that was always an interesting kind of contrast when I shifted between these two contexts growing up.
Yeah, because it almost sounds like, there's these two different extremes, right? Especially what you said about rule following and then rule breaking. And did you find yourself just kind of landing in the middle? Is that kind of what happened? Or like was there one side that kind of like the pendulum swung a little bit further? Because I guess it's like the you spent more of your time in China, right, at the school, but then you had these breaks from like, going in the summer. But yeah, like how did it kind of like take root? Because I know you said that, as like a young person, you're just a sponge and absorbing everything. But I don't know, like I'm sure that there were certain things that resonated on a deeper level or that felt more right. Like, could you maybe unpack more of like
Yeah.
what that experience was like?
Yeah. I think I think just because of my family upbringing and whatnot, tend to be more of a rule follower. And so it was interesting to go to an environment like that summer camp, and be put in these like very social situations as like one of the few people who weren't actually living in the US. Like I don't know how many international students went to that summer camp. So I was kind of the odd one out in that way. And I always had to go through this process of like explaining myself. So I think adjusting to like the rules in the end was fine. The more interesting part was trying to figure out like how do I like present myself to my peers, or like also how do I keep in touch with them afterwards. I think that was definitely a challenge because you wanted to like make friends and continue on with these friendships because you form these really close bonds during the summer, but then you like move back to Shanghai and you're in a different time zone and it's a lot harder to connect with people. So I think that was something that was like top of mind for me as a middle schooler. Um, I think that and then on the other hand, in my own school, I think my own way of kind of pushing back, or at least like acknowledging some of the effects that like rule following or like having this really strict academic environment, um, and then like how it impacted people. The way I pushed back on that was focusing more on mental health in particular, and so that was kind of really my motivation of wanting to end up creating like a psychology mental health club in high school, because I had so many friends, myself included, but definitely a lot of friends, especially who felt so pressured that they just didn't really know how to show up in school. Like I think in that environment, essentially, if you didn't get good grades, you were automatically going to feel more stressed out because there's so much push from your parents, from the school to do well academically, um, to do well in like the STEM subjects in particular, and not so much humanities and arts. And so from a learning perspective, at least for people who were, more diverse learners or had different interests that were not STEM, it was a more challenging environment. And so, yeah, I think in that way, I tried to go against the mainstream a bit by creating these spaces where people could chat about their journeys, what they needed, like have human, very human conversations and processings of their experiences, um, rather than, just be focused on talking about this assignment that you have to get done in different spaces. And so, yeah, I think that was in my own ways, both within myself, I guess, and then in my extracurriculars, is trying to figure out how to um, create spaces for connection, that like, regardless of whatever rules and restrictions there were.
Yeah, right. I mean, it sounds like not just creating connections amongst people in your community, but it sounds like you started with that initial connection just with yourself and like identifying, whoa, like there's a certain need for us to have this space to think about what kind of impact, like what is the toll that these studies are taking on my own sense of well-being, and yeah, like why not be able to have this kind of club that enables us to like talk about it as like a healthy outlet. And I'm sure that also plays into how you would do academically. So it's not too out of left field, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is that um, that action of yours came from lived experience, of you kind of trying to make sense of like, well, like how do I assess the environment that I'm in, and then how do I recognize like my own embeddedness within an environment to like what is most conducive to my own flourishing,
Yeah.
and then being like, yeah, this is not just myself, but it's also for everyone else around me. And then that ties into, I think, these very careful observations that you made while being in different contexts, right? Being in the US or in the summer, being back in Shanghai, but just having maybe a greater sense of like urgency to pick out details of like what is acceptable, what is the kind of mainstream, but then also how am I being kind of caught in the current of these larger forces, and then I need to swim, right? And you need to keep above water. And I think there's a certain wisdom that comes from like being able to draw from those observations and make a very clear path of like, this is what I want to do, right? And then that very clearly ties into what you then studied in undergrad, right? With psychology being initial like main focus. Um, could you maybe, well, I still want to kind of stay in the international school realm because I find this really fascinating.
Yeah.
So, you created a club, mental health or mental wellness club at your school. And, you know, being in Shanghai, I'm sure that attracts a lot of people from different parts of the world to then have their child be put into this international school. And so, what was it like, being in an environment where, especially I would imagine in your high school years, where maybe the population was of international students was, probably at its densest, but like everyone's navigating a new, kind of new culture and also negotiating how they present like themselves in terms of their identity and their national background to each other. Um, could you speak about what was it like making friends in that environment? And
Yeah.
also, could you kind of bring in the component of your own kind of, Chinese ancestry? Because I know that negotiating that identity as someone who is, like you can say like looks Chinese, but then you're much more than just Chinese, right? Because of this experience going back and forth. I think that's an interesting component that can also be brought into this.
Yeah. Definitely. I think I always think of, again, I go back to this question of like, where are you from? Because we're asked that so often. And what I've noted in the past is if I'm in Shanghai, when I was in Shanghai, usually I'd say, oh, I'm from Hong Kong, because it gives them a bit more context and it's actually closer, I guess, to Shanghai than like anywhere in the US is. Um, but if I'm in the US, I might say, oh, I'm from Shanghai. Um, and then if I'm in Hong Kong, I'll probably, I don't know, say some answer or the other, or say like, oh, I like lived in the mainland, but then I was born in Hong Kong and have family there. So I think that also was interesting to note when I was in Shanghai, where it wasn't just like my identity as someone who was like in the US or in like mainland China, but also like in my identity as someone who's like born in Hong Kong and as then a Hong Kong citizen was also I think another identity that was important to me. But like you mentioned navigating friendships and like navigating the social environment. So my school was interesting because it was an international school, but it was also very Chinese in many ways and overall very Asian. So our population wasn't that diverse. It was really like ethnicity wise, mostly like Chinese, Korean, Japanese. Um, and then like various Asian contexts. I ended up gravitating. I mean, because it was like English curriculum and we followed mostly like US school curriculum, most people could speak English. I think I gravitated more towards people who are ABCs, like American born Chinese, who, because of like often parents' work reasons, had moved from the US to China. So I shared a lot more like common language there. But at the same time, I was like, compared to now, even, I was much more Chinese back then in a way. Like I was much more fluent in the language. I'm still bilingual, but my Mandarin and I think colloquial Mandarin has uh, been unfortunately not so great lately. But then I think there's we use Chinglish essentially as our main language communicating. So that's like a combination of Chinese and English. Um, it was helpful to have friends who like knew American pop culture references. Um, and then, yeah, I mean, I also made like a lot of friends who like were Korean, for example. And so that is also like kind of uniquely like a familiar culture or like group for me, or like certain like interactions or games we played. Um, so I think, yeah, it was a mixture of different experiences. Um, I think unfortunately, what bonded us in the end with all of this, because again, I went to a very rigorous school, was like our experience with academics. So, like, if anything, that was the cultural glue. Is just like, oh, complaining about this assignment we had to do. Um, Actually, the other piece that was interesting about Shanghai. So Shanghai has a pretty large, like you mentioned, a pretty large expat community. Um, and I definitely found myself also more comfortable in a community of expats, of people who had moved to China for various reasons, than maybe people who were more like embedded in the local school system. I think in some ways, like even though I grew up in China, I can't really speak to being a local school student or the experiences that, go with that education system wise, like going through the Gaokao system, or even other like cultural references. And so I think that is the bit like what you mentioned earlier too, of like being more than Chinese or even being almost feeling like can't really represent the more like common mainstream Chinese experience is because I didn't grow up in um, that local environment. And I almost feel like I'm not equipped with some of the knowledge. Like I don't even know China as well as your average, maybe like local Chinese student who lived there for 13 years would. Um, so I think yeah, that's definitely also something else that I have been considering and like, what does it mean, for me to have lived in a country for that long, but also feel like I can't really represent it fully. Like I'm just because I'm in that like in between space or this like unique international school space. Um, yeah, so a lot of different uh, social circles there, I guess, and like sense of belonging that I was trying to figure out.
Of course. Well, I mean, just at that age in general, it's such a, these formative years really beg the question, like, who am I? And we look around to our friend network, right? And kind of they're like reflections of ourselves and like shared sense of like, okay, we're kind of like in this particular school environment together. And there's definitely that sense of like kind of bonding despite maybe, some of these different backgrounds of like, okay, from Korea or Japan and then also from China. But like, there's definitely this kind of unique experience of like, okay, but it's not like a either or. It's not just the local Chinese experience, but it's like something apart from that. And it's yeah, very interesting to hear how you're kind of teasing apart like what were some of those components that really made it different for yourself. And it's in part the yeah, different like kind of Asian backgrounds. It's also your own kind of like embeddedness within Chinese culture. It's like Hong Kong, but there's also the mainland kind of dynamic, and then there's also this IB like kind of broader philosophy that kind of is trying to bring everyone together in the sense of like shared sense of global citizen kind of vibe or international mindedness. I think is the term that IB likes to use a lot. And
Yeah,
yeah, that's so this, but like the last part that you're talking about with like your own kind of like reconciling of your Chinese identity, and I think this actually ties in really nice to like the recent experience that you had about a year ago going to China, because it just kind of seems like it's a nice like back then in the past, like kind of wrestling with like what is my Chinese identity. Maybe at that point you were feeling more Chinese because again you were living in Shanghai, but then right now you're kind of or you were just expressing how like, oh yeah, I don't really use Mandarin in the colloquial way, like on a day-to-day basis. And but at the same time you kind of see yourself in a professional lens as like being more of a liaison in like professional context. But then it seems like more recently with this trip to China, you were able to see yourself like as like a ambassador writ large, in terms of exploring that. So I'm kind of curious to hear. Well, first, what was that trip for you? Like, could you explain what you were doing in China, and then also kind of what were some of those like reflection points that you had as like kind of in this moment, where are you at in that sense of like Chinese identity? Because I feel like it ties back to what you were sharing when you were in high school.
yeah, yeah. I'll touch on that trip, Scott, and then I'll probably touch on some other experiences. Because
Of
I
course.
have fortunately been able to like go back home in the sense of Shanghai, at least like maybe once every 2 years, which I know is like more often than some people have. Um, and I think each time I go back, there's always a different sense of nostalgia and reflection and under like reminiscing almost about this like past life and try to figure out like what parts of that still, am I carrying through still in today. But for that trip in particular, so it was organized. an alum at Hugsy, Harvard Grad School of Ed, and we went to Hong Kong and Beijing, and close to Beijing, somewhere in Shanxi as well, just as a quick day trip, with a focus on understanding like education innovation, so what that looks like in Chinese schools right now. Had the opportunity to sit with Peking University students and professors and talk about like how AI is influencing education, different cultural exchange programs between the US and China as well, especially in the higher ed space, getting a view on things like robotics development in China as well. So just overall like digitization and emerging tech and how that's influenced this country. And yeah, it was interesting professionally because I got to visit more schools in China and honestly didn't even probably do that as much when I was living as a student in China. Just talking to students and understanding their goals and dreams. And then from a curricular perspective, like that there's a lot of emphasis on building like global citizenship and building experiences for students to experience many different cultures and contexts, often in the US as well. So that was interesting. And then personally, I was also like the de facto translator in many ways, especially for my friends who didn't speak Chinese, and that like translation is always an interesting moment where you think about your own identity and how to you're not just translating a language directly, but like translating a cultural context, right? Like some like funny moments were explaining like intestines to like my white friend, like because it's a common thing that you might eat in like hot pot in Chinese context, and so you know sharing that like, oh hey, this is like an experience, or how to even interact with people on a day-to-day basis, like little nuances and interactions I think were interesting to pull out from that moment. um, yeah, so I think through translating, I also reflected more on the things I could and could not translate for my friends, because of cultural differences or because like I didn't even have a good enough understanding of like how to explain the higher ed system in China because I didn't go through that system. Yeah, so I think that trip was like really important because of that. And then on a separate note, there was another trip I made recently to China that really stood out to me. Is I visited my grandpa's ancestral home, or like the place that he grew up. And you know, this idea of like laojia, like old home, is pretty important in China. Like where you're from, often it's from more like rural areas, and then people move to like the cities to work or study and whatnot. So my grandpa grew up in Fujian, China. It's this province in like right across the coast from Taiwan, so southeastern China. And I got to visit his actual childhood home, which was super special. Um, and it's now like a kind of a cultural heritage site of that city in Jian'ou. And what's also interesting is I learned a lot more about my own family history. So I always knew that my grandpa was a descendant of a Chinese philosopher and educator. I just didn't get more context beyond that. Um, but that trip really honed in on this connection. So there's this person called Zhu Xi. He was an ancient Chinese philosopher and educator who was super instrumental in changing things about the Gaokao system and building schools and like leading institutions, coming up with philosophies around education, around like family education in particular. And it was really important, like Confucian philosopher or like advocate after you could say like Confucius and Mencius. So like a pretty big deal essentially in Confucian history. And my grandpa's actually like a descendant of this person. And through that trip, got to know more of like other descendants of him and how like they are trying to push for more, you know, cultural recognition of Zhu Xi, like this philosopher's contribution to China, to the world at large. and how they're like rebuilding the city to uh, and reinvesting in the city through tourism by setting up these sites of cultural heritage as well. And the other interesting thing is there are apparently a lot of educators in my grandpa's family, or like in this line of descendants from this very famous educator from the past. And so it was also a moment of me feeling like, wow, I might actually be part of a larger legacy in that moment. Like I'm carrying on this legacy of education. Uh, and it's really special to be able to, one is like have such a close connection with your grandparent, that you're able to go back and see him and how he responds in his childhood home. And he's like hailed as a hero in the city essentially, um, because he's done a lot to work his way towards being in Beijing and working there as a professor, and then supporting the city. Now it's a city, it used to be like a small village that he grew up in. So seeing how people received him, and then also seeing this like passion about education that so many of his side of the family appreciated, and so all of that was a lot of emotional experiences, and I think I'm still processing. Like, okay, like where do I fit in this piece, right? Like I live in the U.S. right now, um, but every time I go back, I'm always reminded of like, oh, this is the place that I grew up in. And like, how do I bring those experiences into my current work, or whether it's just like mindsets I bring, or can I actually, you know, facilitate more communication across cultures in some meaningful way? That was a little bit long-winded, but I think it's because I think many of these things are still things that I'm processing and connecting my like personal to my professional identity.
Wow. No, that was beautifully said. And I'm glad that you shared all that you shared, because it's also super interconnected. And it, I can tell there's like this sense of like, it's like awe, wonder, and pride, especially about, going to like learn more about your ancestry and family background, and understanding that you're part of this lineage of educators.
Yeah.
And I think that that is really important to recognize that you're part of something much bigger, right? And that the scale of that is not necessarily like limiting to a village, right, in a rural part of China, but to the credit of your grandfather and your ancestors, it's actually extended to it's expanded to such an extent where now you're in the U.S. and you're still just as connected, right, in that way. It's wonderful that you were able to have that experience and then be in this kind of moment of reflection of like, how am I connecting this to what I've experienced so far? Because clearly there's like something even more exciting in the future with, again, understanding digital spaces, how we can really set people up for success in terms of like not just acquiring new knowledge, because I think I would imagine you'd agree that it's education is much more than just learning for knowledge sake, but there's something kind of like deeper in the human experience of like how we're tied to one another. How do we create culture, and like create meaning and value in our lives, and then how that has ripple effects from generation to generation. All of that seems that you're kind of, again, bringing all of this together, and I think not necessarily giving up one side for the other, right? It's just that the world is expanding in such a fast pace that I think none of us have like a definitive understanding of like, this is what it is. But it's what it sounds like is that you're actually drawing these lessons about like, where are we going in the future, by really understanding your own past background. Are some of the conversation, like some of the reflections happening with like your parents as well, in terms of like, I don't know, from your grandfather, like learning about that background, but then also like the role that your parents played in like helping you further your own mission as an educator?
Yeah, I think uh, I want to quickly touch on something you said that was also interesting. I think digital spaces and like social media in particular can be really, when used well, really good bridges and cultures. And like an example I always think of is with Snapchat, which I don't use anymore. I don't think people use Snapchat as much, but I remember way back when I used to use it. And I was amazed when they first introduced a feature of going into maps and like just clicking into uh, someone's like little, circle bubble and anywhere in the world, and you could just see in that moment like what they're seeing. And I think like an idea like that, or if you just like go on TikTok right now and just like look at influencers who live in different places, like there's so much more possibility of understanding each other, kind of almost ironically, because technology sometimes can separate us, but I think also can afford us opportunities um, to step into another person's shoes literally, because you can see what they're seeing through their phone. Um, and I think that's really powerful to think about, just as like a general thing to riff off of based off what you
Yeah.
said.
No, we can stay on that point as well, because I think that's really fascinating. I mean, even just when I was like I think growing up, like even just understanding what does a time zone mean, I had no conception of it. But like what you're saying about like TikTok or the social media platforms, and just kind of putting a pin in different places that you've been at, and then being able to see like into this portal right through the video, this is what they're doing, this is how they're moving, like this
Yeah,
is literally their navigation. Like that affords new opportunities and like new insight as far as like their sense of positionality, and sense of possibility of who they're becoming, right? Which I think
yeah,
ties into global citizenship too, right?
absolutely. And it's something you can do on a personal, like daily basis. It's also something that educators can use like a classroom tool. So one thing that I learned a lot from trying out in like my classroom when I was teaching students from different parts of the world. I taught foundational literacy because these were, again, mostly newcomer students. And we were going on a lesson about adjectives and descriptions of different places. So I thought, okay, like what if we could use um, Google's like little orange guy to, drop a pin in a certain location and just use the street view function to see and describe what you're seeing. Um, and I asked my students, like, can you show me your hometown or whatever is closest to your hometown that has like a street view function? And immediately, like in the back of the classroom, there are these two boys who usually are super disengaged because they're tired or because it's just been a long day. And it's really hard when you're a student and your first language is not English, but you're constantly submerged in that environment. But usually they were really tired. And all of a sudden, this one student like perked up and it's like, oh, okay, wait, like I want to go to Guatemala. Like, let me show you this place where that's really close to where I'm from. And so he dropped it over there and like he just started like excitedly trying to explain with some English too and on what he was seeing, and other people joined in. And it asked like, oh, like let's drop it to this location next. Like let's drop it in this place in Afghanistan. And like I think that's a to me that was a really eye-opening example of like how can you build a or like leverage students' multicultural identities, right? Because they have so many experiences and stories to share. Engage them in the classroom in that way, make them feel seen, and make their cultural identities feel heard. Um, and then use that as a way to segue into the lesson or other content you're trying to teach. In this case, it's like adjectives, but also beyond that, there's so much more. Like we're learning about where people are from, right? And how they view their home cultures. And so I think that was something that was like I think a key moment too when I thought about like, okay, what can technology offer in terms of learning and building virtual learning experiences? Um, Now you can do like a similar function essentially in like virtual worlds, right? And build out spaces for people to teleport immediately to another country, to speak that language and to learn directly, instead of traveling thousands of miles to get there. And so I definitely think there's like a lot of exciting developments happening in using virtual worlds, or in using like simulations that you can even create when you're
Mm.
talking to like a large language model, to provide opportunities to introduce like other cultures, or at least like let students be more engaged in the first place.
Yeah, I love that activity that you did about like the orange guy from Google Maps, and you throw them on a map and you can see the street view. That's brilliant. I wanted to ask this question because I know with like a lot of the digital technologies that we see there, whether it's like Street View in Google Maps, or maybe take a virtual tour of this one museum or this one location, that the sense of access, especially for those living, further away from that actual location, is incredible, right? It's unprecedented. But at the same time, right, there may be this sense of like, if like, let's say for you, you've actually been to that museum before, right? You've seen the Sistine Chapel, right? There's a marked difference between actually
Mhm.
being there in person and then the digital side of it. So do you see these technologies as like, is the trajectory to like be less of like a proxy of like just kind of taking a segment of that and giving like an expedient means of like understanding that experience? Or do you see it as evolving to an extent where it can actually be its own full experience and is not really one to compare with the actual in-person experience? Like, how are you reconciling between like the kind of physical world that we live in and understanding that like sometimes taking that long trip is worthwhile and is part of it? Or is there this build out of a digital world where that actually is kind of where we need to really be focusing more of our time in, or there's certain opportunities presented there?
Yeah, I like both if possible, right? Like if you have the means to travel, travel, because I think that is a experience that cannot be replaced with just digital means. The amount of immersion that you have, right, when you're traveling to a different place, um, and again, definitely speaking from my own experiences, like just having grown up in two different countries, has been so insightful in helping me understand how to talk to others from different backgrounds and how to listen also properly from people of different backgrounds. So that's definitely there. But I think like if you can't do that, then the next best thing is to make friends with people. Even maybe some of that could even be online. To talk to people from a different place, travel there virtually, have someone show you their world from their Zoom camera, in some ways. Um, I thought about that too with our like online master's programs at Harvard. Like you have so many people calling in from different places. It'd be really nice if someone could just like take their computer and like walk around and show them like, hey, this is like a day in my life and this is what I'm seeing. And I think even something simple like that could be really powerful. Um, I took one of the courses I took as a grad student was this course on like technology and language learning. And we actually had a session where we could correspond with students from, I'm forgetting which city it was, but somewhere in France, I believe. It was a quick session, but we did get together and we talked about there are these activities you can build out, right, that can foster connection over even like digital virtual spaces. Some of them were like very word association, like what does this word home or like citizenship mean to you? And then you can kind of see different definitions come up based off of like that person's cultural upbringing. So we did that with like students from another cultural context, and it was really interesting to have moments of trying to break down right these cultural barriers and understand what it's like to view something from someone else's perspective. So yeah, I think it's both, and it still offers like virtual experiences still offer a um, pretty full experience as long as you are emphasizing the like human connection and the human conversations that come out of those spaces.
No, I totally agree. And I think that, the central word, right, in all of this is connection. But I know that with how the internet and like all of these kind of like digital infrastructures have been rapidly built and are just going to be exponentially built even larger because of AI models, it can lead to, at least from my perspective, kind of like taking for granted, like how easy and like frictionless a lot of those connections can be. But what I've come to know in my own life, whether it's through engaging someone virtually, right, connecting, at a distance online or meeting in person, but connection is something that you have to work at, right? It's something that, kind of has to come from your own like initiative as well, and that it goes across, right, from one person to another, from one point to another point. And yeah, and I guess, this might be something that you've thought a lot about, and it sounds like very evident in even the projects that you've done in the classroom and in your current work. But there's a certain level like intentionality that comes with like creating that kind of like digital space, right? In terms of like identifying that one, group in France, right, to talk with, in terms of, facilitating in a way that really makes it so that everyone feels heard, how, it's important for them to share out, but like from a place of like pride and excitement of like, I want to put myself out there in this way and that way. So,
Yeah, technology is a tool. Like, we're the ones facilitating how we wanna use that tool, and so I think that's where, like, my interest in psychology and so, like, how do we develop human connections, or how do we understand, right, people who might think differently, like, that matters actually so much more, right, in the age of AI and digital spaces. Um, so, yeah, I think these are tools, and how we choose to use them for very human means is still very important to consider, and that's where being an educator in this time is really exciting.
it's exciting. Is it a little daunting? Do you ever have moments where, you think the tool becomes less a tool and more like takes a life of its own, especially with, the AI conversations happening? Like, how do
Yeah.
you kind of mitigate that in your own sense as far as like using it intentionally, but from a place of like empowerment towards a certain goal, and then not necessarily because of massive corporate interests that want to mine our data for this or that reason?
Yeah, and I've been having these, like, AI and learning design focus groups recently, and, as part of my work, and working with students in, a class that the Teaching and Learning Lab is affiliated with, that the grad school led, um, of, like, this question of, like, is AI a tool, or is it something that completely transforms, like, a paradigm shift in how we think about everything in the world, right? Um, I think that you can make cases for both, but in the end, right, like, where the human judgment matters is, and this goes into being a global citizen too, is just the ability to, like, listen to someone deeply and understand, or try to understand where they're coming from. You don't have to agree with their perspectives, um, but being able to think of a problem and think about, like, different perspectives on that problem, I think overall is a really key skill, whether you're in the age of AI or not. And probably more important now, because we're constantly being overloaded with information, that we can get super quickly, from, like, every corner of the internet now, just, like, summarized into a little chatbot in front of you, or right, with, like, agentic AI as well. Like, you there's so much that can be done for you. And so I think, yeah, more than ever, like, the ability to listen, to think differently, on problems, and to understand that there are multiple approaches and multiple ways of, like, showing up in this world. At least acknowledging that, right? Even if you don't subscribe to certain values or beliefs of others, is crucial. Especially also, like, with AI, and speaking of data, right? Like, algorithmic bias, and how do we make sure that these models that we're, putting out in the world, or that students in particularly are interacting with, are not biased to certain worldviews, or that at least, like, students are made aware, because it's probably impossible to prevent bias at this point because of just, like, limitations on data and where it's coming from. Yeah, just being aware of those biases existing. So yeah, I think that, like, discernment, of, like, different perspective, different approaches, like, how are we thinking about, um, problems, and just being able to, like, step out of your own world and understand that there's a larger world out there, and there are more perspectives. Like, that is so crucial right now.
Wow, I 100% agree. Thank you so much, Christine. And I feel like that's such a wonderful kind of cap to our conversation, in terms of like understanding from like where you started and like navigating differences and going to different countries, and exploring your own sense of identity, tying that into like a larger kind of like lineage, and like understanding like a deeper purpose of like why are you an educator? And then the times that we're living in are demanding that we really understand these digital technologies, to use them more as tools, like you said, but then also to kind of embrace rather the like either or it's like it's like both, right? We can like kind of find a way to like merge these different kind of like divides, and understand that kind of the perspective taking that we take on really necessitates us to like deeply listen to others and not be so quick to judge and say that we have the right answer, because we see that playing out a lot, especially in politics, of
Mhm.
like this is going to be it, and then if we just kind of bulldoze our way forward, it'll be fine, we'll hit a clearing. But I think there's just been a lot of damage done with a set mentality like that, and that what you're speaking of, what you're articulating in terms of the mindset that is needed in the age that we're living in is much more nuanced, but it's also, I think, very much exploratory and like deeply compassionate of like, yeah, we're still kind of figuring things out, but we also kind of need to do this together.
Yeah.
So I think that
I
that
might
kind of
add
posture
that
is
it's
important.
also not it's not just rosy. I think sometimes when people think like, "Oh, we want world peace, we want people to, like, get together and hear," like, it is hard work, right? It's like to be able to listen and have conversations across
Yeah.
culture, across identities, especially when you might feel like your identity is being threatened in some ways, right? It's super difficult work, but we can acknowledge all of that as we, go on and try to integrate these mindsets into our personal and professional life and how to bridge differences or at least acknowledge those differences and recognize instead of just being in your own world. So yeah, just as a add on.
No, very important add-on. Thank you, Christine. And so, one final question that I have for you before we wrap up: any book or movie recommendations that you'd like to share to the listeners?
Yeah. So I was thinking of like, oh, is there like a more profound recommendation that I could give? But I think there's one that's really close to heart. Um, a movie that was produced in the US that I thought surprisingly covered these nuances of navigating cultures between US and China. It's The Farewell. It's an A24 movie, starring Aquafina and a couple other actors, and it tells her story as someone who is, I guess, like a second gen immigrant, like growing up in New York. But her grandma, who lives in China, gets really sick, and might pass away soon. But no one in the family tells her that she might pass away, and so it's this very interesting cultural concept because. I think for viewers in the US, they might think that's outrageous. Like you're keeping a secret from her. Whereas, from families in China, it might be more like there's more discernment sometimes on like, oh, okay, for like social harmony or cohesion purposes, we can do something different. And so it navigates those cultural concepts and also really showcases like the relationship between different generations of a family that has roots in China and the US and their interactions. And I remember watching that movie with my sister and my mom in a movie theater, and all of us are crying because we resonated with a different character in the movie. Um, I would recommend if you haven't seen it, check it out. It has like these really amazing shots of like random small cities in China that don't usually like get featured on the big screen. And again, these concepts and relationships. So um, it's very specific to like more of the US China context, but I think it does a good job in uh, portraying like how to navigate different cultural settings and topics that are often more sensitive and personal and family relations that go into that.
Mm. Awesome. Thank you so much for that recommendation. And yeah, appreciate you taking the time to share some of your story, to chart this course of like where you've been and looking ahead to where you're headed. It all sounds really exciting, and it also sounds deeply meaningful for you. Something that you're still processing, like you said. But nonetheless, I hope this conversation helped you to connect a few more dots or reaffirm certain aspects of kind of the work that you're doing and how important it is right now. So, wanted to give you the last word. Any final thoughts or send offs as we wrap up this wonderful conversation?
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much, Scott, for being a great host. I definitely am like having more thoughts and processes right now. Um, I would say to everyone who is an educator or is near a young person in some way, um, just thinking about how do we build a world together where we can facilitate difficult conversations and build those, skills of listening and empathy. Um, in a world that's like increasingly polarized and divided. And then again, what does it mean to be a global citizen then? How do we make these connections across cultures, across countries? Like, I think we can all be a part of that. We're all living in different spaces and communicating with different people. So, I think it's just a really pressing and beautiful question to consider.